Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And before I begin, I would like to say Ken is in his 99th year, as you know now. I meet him for lunch once a week, and we go to the same place, like Darby and Joan. We go off to Gleason's in Booterstown. And during the course of the lunch, I'm just waiting to see who in the restaurant is going to come. And usually it's a lady of indeterminate age who will be bold enough to come over and say, "Excuse me, I'm sorry for disturbing you, but I just had to shake your hand." Now that happens every week I'm with him, so I'm presuming it happens every day. One day it was slightly different. As we got up to leave, Ken's path was blocked, and a young man, I'd say he was around 24, jumped to his feet, took the chair away which was blocking Ken's path, and Ken said, "Thank you very much." And the young man turned to Ken Whittaker and said, "Oh no, Dr. Whittaker, it's you who I should thank." And I thought that was fantastic. Whatever about the lady of indeterminate age like myself, that a young boy would have that in him to know that this man was somehow special. Just a little start before I start. I normally do not have notes, no more than Fergal, but on this occasion I think it is very important that I do have notes, because this is really, I suppose, the first public speech, or talk, should I say, on Ken Whittaker that I really have given. I've done a lot of interviews over the course of when the book was published, of course, but a lot of them were I felt, quite superficial. I presume there's possibly not one politician here in the audience today, and maybe perhaps with what I'm about to say with very good reason. But it is important that I stick to some kind of a paper. Is that okay? Can I be heard? I can. No. Was it better before?
Sorry? Don't hear. No, just talk again.
1, 2, 3. Oh, yes. As we approach the centenary commemorations for 1916, it is fitting to recall that 1916 also commemorates the centenary birth of another patriot, one who led a revolution of another kind. T.K. Whittaker's life of public service parallels the history of the modern Irish state, in whose economic, social, educational, political and cultural evolution he played a pivotal role. I'm sure that the theme of this year's McGill Summer School, Ireland at the Crossroads, might well bring a wry smile to Ken Whittaker's face, having witnessed, averted and managed many such crossroads throughout his long life of public service. Indeed, many issues open for discussion here during the course of the week, from unstable governance, upgrading the technical and managerial skills of politicians and public servants, the future of rural Ireland, the formulation of a visionary national development plan. Not sure he'd have liked the word visionary. Such topics for Ken Whittaker must surely resonate with the phrase "plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose." From a modest background in Rostrevor, County Down, at the age of 6, Ken Whittaker's family moved south to the town of Drogheda, where at the local Christian Brothers school, his potential was first nurtured. Unable to pursue a preferred medical career due to family financial constraints, in 1934 his footsteps led him to a career in the civil service, entering at the basic clerical officer grade. There his talent broke through predictive promotional convention, and his record rise through the ranks, unequalled to this day, saw him at 39 years of age become Secretary of the Department of Finance in 1956. Against a background of economic stagnation, rampant emigration, lack of entrepreneurial spirit, and an atmosphere of national despondency, motivated, as he modestly told me, by a sense of anxiety and urgency about Ireland's economic and political future, and to make some positive contribution towards the betterment of the people. With the help of a willing band of acolytes, he devised economic development, a blueprint for the economic regeneration of the country. Detailed, meticulous, and practical, written in a style and in a language aimed at the ordinary citizen as much as at politicians, economic development offered a radical remedy. The replacement of non-productive by productive capital expenditure, the introduction of free trade, and an end to the isolation and protectionism of a previous era. It lowered, ladies and gentlemen, the barriers that Ireland had erected around itself and allowed the Irish people to look at their country not from some mystic, historically idealised vantage point, but from eye level. And above all, economic development offered hope and a way out of the economic quagmire in which Ireland and its people were fast bound. Economic development and the first programme of economic expansion, which was derived from it, led to a period of unparalleled growth and optimism. And I think it is perhaps of interest to note that economic development was undertaken on a totally voluntary basis. Ken Whitaker and his team, working outside office hours, on their own time, without any notion or expectation of monetary or promotional recompense, but simply because it was needed to be done. I think you'll have to agree, in this age of entitlement, top-ups and bonuses, such civic-minded motivations seem sadly, somehow, anachronistic. As Secretary of the Department of Finance, Ken Whitaker left his imprint in many relevant ways. In 1957, for example, his concern, and I quote, that the variety and difficulty of administrative problems have so increased and the tools and techniques for solving them have so developed as to render administration more than ever a science. This led to the establishment of the Institute of Public Administration to cater for the educational, research, development and training needs in the public service. Today, the Whitaker School of Government and Management, established in the IPA in his honour, ensures the continued pursuit of his objective. His belief that public servants should be, and I quote, well versed in economics, led to the establishment of a university scholarship scheme in the public service. He was unhappy with the quality of the economic courses then available in the national universities, and he actually forwarded his own suggested syllabus for economics in the NUI, much of which was subsequently adopted by university authorities. In the course of compiling economic development, he also became aware of the shortcomings in both quantity and quality of economic research and analysis available in the public service. With the substantial grant which he elicited from the Ford Foundation in America, and he told me he was at the IMF meetings and he heard that the guy in the Ford Foundation who had the giving of these grants used to attend Mass in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. So Ken said he became a regular Mass goer for the duration of his stay. And he also heard that he took a coffee in a diner around the corner. So Ken also took a coffee in the diner. And the result was that for a substantial grant, I think it was 200,000 American dollars, which he elicited from the Ford Foundation, the Economic and Social Research Institute was founded in 1960. It is interesting to note that in more recent times, Ken Whitaker viewed what he considered to be a fall-off in numbers of suitably qualified and experienced staff in the Department of Finance and at the Central Bank as a dangerous and worrying development. A situation, I think we would all agree, that may well have contributed to Ireland's economic and financial woes. During the 1960s, Ken Whitaker spearheaded Ireland's convoluted path towards membership of the European Economic Community. A fervent supporter of Ireland's participation in the community, he led many delegations to European capitals, culminating with a private meeting in 1967 with the implacable Charles de Gaulle. He's later uneased that the idealism, realism, the community ethos, the élan vital that motivated the community's founding fathers and that is enshrined in the Treaty of Rome were being sidelined by purely monetary considerations has a certain resonance today in view of current difficulties in Greece and elsewhere. Regarding the European monetary system, it is also interesting to note Ken Whitaker's less than enthusiastic reaction to Ireland's abandonment of sterling in 1979, a move which he then, perhaps prophetically, described as being a quixotic gesture. In 1969, Ken Whitaker was appointed Governor of the Central Bank at a critical time in the bank's development. On his appointment, he gave notice that the bank would be, and I quote, the warning light, and that it also might well have unpalatable things to say in the future. Under his governorship, the bank was transformed into a dynamic and effective institution, which he guided with a firm hand through many economic and financial upheavals at home and abroad, including, if you recall, 2 major international oil crises in the 1970s. At the commencement of his period of office, he set out to preserve the autonomy of the central bank vis-à-vis the government and the commercial banking sector, guided by the provisions of the Central Bank Act, which states, and may I add, which still states, that what pertains to the control of credit, the constant and predominant aim should be the welfare of the people as a whole. He successfully resisted efforts by the Department of Finance in 1970, who wanted to obtain statutory control over the exercise of credit policy in the economy, a move which Ken Whitaker noted at the time, I quote, he could not regard as being in the national interest. His words to the then Minister for Finance, that, and I quote, as a good Catholic, I recognise the supreme authority of the Pope, but like a good bishop, I claim jurisdiction within my own diocese. Was more seriously followed by his ultimatum that if the minister pursued the matter, then he would have no alternative but to resign as governor. And this, of course, subsequently ensured that credit policy remained under central bank control. Later, against the background of runaway inflation, balance of payments deficit, galloping current and capital expenditure and irrational pay awards, he enforced strict credit constraints over the commercial banks, restricting credit to productive purposes with penalties for increases in gross lending to the overheating property sector, 1970s, keep in mind, as well as stemming the tide of external capital inflows. He resisted numerous government attempts to fund budgetary concessions for non-productive purposes out of the coffers of the central bank, and both privately and in public through the central bank bulletins, and indeed also in the press, gave forceful advice on the economic and financial policy before it was enacted, thus preventing even greater excess. In the area of regulation and supervision, under Ken Whitaker's governorship, the central bank's control over the Irish banks evolved and strengthened. So where did it all go wrong? Why did that warning light fail to flash during the reckless credit-creating years of the Celtic Tiger? What malfunction and the lack of, or the muted, unpalatable words emanating from Dame Street left him, as he admits, perplexed and appalled? His choice of words to the new governor, Patrick Honohan, and I quote, "I'm counting on you to save the country from national humiliation," expressed the depth of his disappointment at the bank's perceived failure to discharge its obligations. While Ken Whittaker is the first to acknowledge the immense changes that have since revolutionised the banking sector, the globalisation of the industry, the impact of technology, the blurring of demarcation between financial institutions, the array of new investment and credit instruments, the onset of the borderless world of finance, it is still difficult to imagine that under his stewardship that warning light would not have been flashing in Dame Street long before the banking collapse occurred, or that he would have agreed to the disastrous decision to separate the supervisory and regulatory functions from the central bank. And during the so-called Celtic Tiger debacle, while a diminution in the bank's authority may well have been the result of European Central Bank intervention, the Irish Central Bank retained sufficient authority nationally to curb the doubling of house prices, the tripling of credit to the building industry, and the sanctioning of loans up and beyond 100% that occurred in the space of 7 years. And with Ken Whittaker on the board of the ECB, Monsieur Trichet would undoubtedly have been faced with an able and determined opponent to his policy of light-touch regulation, leading as it did to the inadequate and incompetent supervision of the Irish banking system and to Ireland's subsequent humiliation. In 1976, Ken Whittaker resigned from public office, or thought he did. But his services to the state, if anything, increased. From the Senate, where he's unique in being nominated by 2 major political parties while still speaking as an independent, to the Council of State, to his 20-year chancellorship of the National Universities of Ireland. And on this, I think I should stop and just consider Ken Whittaker never actually attended university. And perhaps that was the reason for his success, maybe. His degrees came as an external student, and really, in a way, his economics, I always find, if you read any of Ken Whittaker's economic documents, including economic development itself, the language is simple. It's on a practical basis. There is no visionary ethos in it. It is common sense practicality. And I think myself that in a way that he wasn't part of that rare academe atmosphere, that it reflected in how he put his policies, his economic policies, into effect and how he formulated them. That is just my own take on that. It may not be wrong. On a voluntary basis, his wise counsel and ability steered a mind-boggling range of public commissions and committees, from penal reform, fishery policy, constitution reform, to chairmanship of such bodies as Bord na Gaeilge, Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, Royal Irish Academy, Alliance Française, ESRI, Irish Folklore Commission, co-founder of the British Irish Association and of the Agency for Personal Services Overseas. The list, ladies and gentlemen, numbers over 40, all on a voluntary basis. His contribution to national and international debate on a range of topics, from economics to salmon conservation, is evidenced by the hundreds of articles and speeches he compiled and delivered after his official retirement from public office, right up to 2008. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of his public service I discovered was the seminal behind-the-scenes role he played between 1967 and 1997 in the search for peace in Northern Ireland. As Dr. Maurice Hayes testified, when everyone else, ministers, soldiers, civil servants, diplomats, were running around like headless chickens, Ken Whittaker stood out as a man for all seasons. Born in Northern Ireland, having a deep-set abhorrence to violence, The practical and common sense approach he brought to issues previously clouded and impeded by emotional rhetoric all mark his effort. From initiating cross-border relationships as early as the 1950s with his civil service counterparts in Northern Ireland on issues of mutual cross-border benefit from electricity supply, transport to the Erne motorway, to arranging the historic meeting between Sean Lemass and Captain Terence O'Neill in Stormont in January 1965. Despite the terrible chaos of the following decades, he never gave up on the search for peace by constitutional means. In 1969, amidst the carnage, rioting and tear gas, he wrote Jack Lynch's famous Tralee speech, which publicly and for the first time committed the Irish government to a policy of reunification by the principle of consent. In 1970, he embarked on a behind-the-scenes dialogue with his opposite numbers in the public sector and banking sectors in Northern Ireland and in the UK, from which, over the next 2 decades, emanated many policy documents, which in turn informed government policy on Northern Ireland, both here in the Republic and in the UK. Indeed, one of his policy documents, Northern Ireland, A Possible Solution, written in 1971, is in reality the Good Friday Agreement for slow learners, albeit with almost 30 years of ensuing violence, destruction and the tragic loss of over 3,700 lives in the meantime. Another motivation in Ken Whittaker's life is his love and commitment to the Irish language. Fostered in his distant childhood in Drogheda and in Ranafast, here in the Donegal Gaeltacht, it still burns with the same intensity today. As in his approach to the national economy and to Northern Ireland, his approach to the language was also one of practical application. From initiating articles in the Irish language in the Department of Finance and in the central bank bulletins, his advocation of bilingualism as a national policy rather than the more impractical replacement of English by Irish, to his enlightened chairmanship of Bord na Gaeilge, he left his mark. In a world exposed to such powerful and ever-changing technological advances and to the standardisation and globalisation of every aspect of our life, including culture and language, as Ken Whittaker notes, government policy is no longer enough to ensure the survival of the Irish language. It also requires an acknowledgement by all of us that the language is worth saving and that we have the will as a community to ensure that it does. The question posed by this summer school, does Ireland need a new visionary development plan by another Ken Whittaker, in this year of 2015, in my opinion, can no longer be addressed in a national context. Ireland's economic future as part of the European Union is at the mercy now of a global imperialistic market economy. The calamitous policies that have driven not only Ireland's financial institutions, but those of more powerful countries, from reckless lending practices to the rigging of key bank interest rates, together with the detachment of finance and economics from any sense of societal responsibility or accountability, that has resulted in some 90% of the world's wealth resting in the hands of 10% of the population, all are an anathema to Ken Whittaker's generation. Today, in a world where democratically elected governments and the people they represent appear as mere pawns driven and controlled by financial markets, rating agencies and hedge funds, the question Ken Whittaker posed in the 1980s for Ireland has a relevance today, but in a global context. And he asked, is it little more than a fiction that Parliament and government are sovereign? Does the state's power rest precariously on day-by-day tolerance of its authority by powerful sectional interests? Are governments nowadays to be compared to the totally deaf Beethoven in his later years, just being allowed to go through the motions of conducting the orchestra while the real control is being exercised elsewhere? I suppose it's something to consider. Yes, the world indeed needs another revolutionary to turn the tide of greed and exploitation, to ensure that financial markets take some responsibility for the effect their policies have on the lives of ordinary citizens and taxpayers. And perhaps the next Ken Whitaker might well do well to be guided by the words that motivated his illustrious predecessor when he wrote, "There are values, moral and intellectual, which are higher than just mere economics. But it makes for a happier and more contented society if everybody has some basic share in wealth and well-being." In Ken Whitaker, ladies and gentlemen, we are reminded of what is best in all of us, both as a society and as individual citizens. His very presence connects us with a time and a society motivated by more caring and ethical principles. Now in his 99th year, his sense of hope, his generosity and good humour continue to burn brightly as each day brings a new interest and a new challenge. He remains sanguine about reputation, noting that if you live long enough, you would either be canonised or found out. The worst fate being found out after you're canonised. During his lifetime, he has received, as you know, many honours and tributes, national and international. One, however, stands out. During the course of writing his biography, it became clear to me why the ordinary citizens of this country conferred the accolade Irishman of the 20th century on this former public servant. For as the so-called icons of Irish society, one by one, fell from their pedestals, as tribunals, trials and inquiries revealed the shortcomings of those entrusted with the care of the country and the welfare of its people, as greed and corruption became the hallmarks of success in Irish society, as the two state institutions over which he once presided failed in their duty of care to prevent the loss of Ireland's economic independence, consigning generations to a future of chronic indebtedness, the people's choice of T.K. Whitaker as Irishman of the 20th century seems now, in 2015, more than ever vindicated. And can I just finally say that the ethos that motivated Ken Whitaker in his economic and financial undertakings on behalf of us, the Irish people, I think are best summed up in what he wrote himself. And he said, "Let us remember that we are not seeking economic progress for purely materialistic reasons, but because it makes possible relief of hardship and want, the establishment of a better social order, the raising of human dignity, and eventually the participation of all who are born in Ireland of the benefits moral and cultural, as well as material, of spending their lives and bringing up their families in Ireland." Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.